colleagues, and you mentioned our Spanish colleagues, and we're working as a trio presidency, trying to establish common priorities and common goals actually for the next 18 months, as far as the combined presidencies are concerned, so then up to the end of 2024. And of course, our Spanish friends just started the work, and by the way, we will be meeting them in Madrid by the end of July to go into a couple of substantive issues as well. Now, as far as an introduction to the subject is concerned, we all know, and you put that forward in the invitation for today as well, that humanitarian needs have been alarmingly, I would say, been increasing and reaching therefore completely staggering numbers of 362 million people in need, and requiring actually, and that's an estimate, 45.8 billion USD to address these needs. Talking about the EU, well, of course, the EU and its member states are important actors in the international humanitarian landscape as donors, as stakeholders, and in terms of the so-called humanitarian diplomacy. There are 3 points that I would like to address today. The first one is the EU level, the Belgian presidency of the EU, and as I said before, in the context of the trio priorities. Well, the funding gap and prioritization of the humanitarian response are priorities of the Spanish, Belgian, Hungarian trio. The trio recognizes the importance of continuing these discussions now that the Council has produced the new conclusions on the subject. Belgium, actually, during our presidency, we aim to highlight the forgotten and underfunded crisis during the 6th month of our tenure. This priority, of course, is closely linked to the discussion on the financing gap and the necessity for the humanitarian system to effectively respond to protracted crisis. Belgium foresees to continue to facilitate the discussions at the European level, of course, on the implementation of the conclusions and do the strategic outreach to emerging and potential humanitarian donors. As you mentioned, we'll have the challenging task of co-organizing the next edition of the European Humanitarian Forum with DG ECHO. The preparations for this event actually have just begun. We're already looking into some elements of practicalities, and we foresee to go into more substantive elements of preparation in September. We see this forum as a platform and an opportunity to continue our discussions on, of course, on collectively addressing the financing gap and the lack of funding in those forgotten contexts and protracted crises. Secondly, I'd like to talk a little bit about the link with the Belgian humanitarian budget and our quality funding. The present Belgian government is and remains committed to achieving the target of 0.7% of ODA by 2030. be honest, if you look at reaching that goal, the last couple of years have demonstrated a standstill because of the COVID crisis and the crisis in Ukraine. So we're developing as well for the new government a so-called growth path to see how we can reach this established goal in the next 5-6 years. The political decisions, of course, will have to be taken by the new Belgian government in a difficult budgetary context. But that's exactly the reason why we all already want to be rather specific in this growth path, and especially on the humanitarian elements. I mentioned the Ukraine crisis, but actually what we have done is to insist at government level for new and additional funding as far as the humanitarian crisis in the Ukraine is concerned, making sure that we don't have to move humanitarian money from the present crisis, and especially from our African partner countries, to the new challenge in Ukraine. We're rather proud that we managed to do that, because of course that's an ongoing debate in all EU member states, and to see how you can cope with that. Actually, our humanitarian budget has increased by nearly 70% in the last 10 years. And that means that at this point, we have more or less a level of humanitarian aid of 200 million euros per year. Trying to augment that, of course, for the next 5 or 6 years, but that will be part of the so-called growth path that I mentioned. The increase in the last years has been accompanied by strong commitments in terms of quality funding. And actually, Belgium allocates 60% of its humanitarian budget flexibly and multi-annually. And we feel that discussions on the funding gap must go hand in hand, of course, with discussions on how to finance this. Maybe a last remark. Living in an administration and having to take care of the needs of political masters, the reality of our humanitarian life is that if we plead for increasing the budget, that decision makers are accountable to Parliament and taxpayers, and that for that reason they seek visibility regarding their humanitarian allocations. Flexible funds and new financing instruments must meet these needs while proving that they are more effective in order to attract more donors and facilitate a shift towards a more pooled funding. Thirdly, reducing humanitarian needs. We feel we cannot discuss the funding gap without addressing the need to take action to reduce those humanitarian needs. Increasing the humanitarian budgets just by itself, for us, is not a real solution, especially for EU member states, whose budgets and resources are under pressure. Faced with the increasing humanitarian needs, there might be a temptation, actually, to divert development aid budgets in favor of humanitarian resources. But it is important to continue investing in structural development programs and projects, especially in the so-called fragile contexts. And this is to address the root causes of fragility. Donors and development actors need to sharpen their capacities to operate in these contexts, and we must engage in real discussions on the associated level of risk. I'd like to point out that the Belgian cooperation policy focuses exactly and especially on fragile contexts, with 11 of our 14 development partner countries who actually can be classified as fragile, and therefore there's an overall fragility approach in our development aid. Mr. Chairman, I hope I have contributed to opening this debate, and I will be interested, of course, in listening and getting into discussion with the panelists, so that this can help as well in better defining our focus for those 18 months of the trio presidency. Thank you very much.
No, thank you very much to you, Mr. Brouwer. And by the way, you anticipated something that I was going to ask you, because usually a keynote speaker, they deliver their speech and then they go. You will stay with us, and we definitely invite you to participate into the discussion that will take place afterward. You set the scene very well. That is to say that you slowly but surely guided us towards two issues that will certainly come back time and again during the discussion. Question is not the money, but how to spend it. A quote for those who are familiar reading the Financial Times over the weekend. And the second thing is, well, you mentioned diversion. Well, referring to the development and humanitarian aid, you mentioned diversion. Some others would refer to nexus, but that will certainly come back again. Thanks a lot for having opened the discussion this way. Now I'm turning to the panel. There were referenced time and again to the role that ECHO is playing. Michael, the floor is yours.
Well, thank you very much, Jean-Louis. Thank you to Hugo in particular for setting the scene so well. And thank you to both Egmont and NRC for these excellent policy papers that I read with great pleasure. I have to admit, although I'm known to be a critical spirit, I have rarely found on so few pages such an accurate description, not only of the situation, but also very good pathways that I think the humanitarian sector needs to consider if it somehow wants to survive. The whole meeting here is under the Mark Lowcock quote, is the sector broke or is it broken? It is definitely broke. I wouldn't say it is broken, but something much worse could happen, that it becomes increasingly irrelevant if we don't hear the signs of time or read the signs of time, or if we now do not use this new situation to adapt. Hugo already gave us some very stark figures that show how much humanitarian needs are rising right now, but I think it's going to get much worse. First, we see this extremely steep rise, 40% more people in humanitarian need now than 2 years ago. And although we are now beyond COVID and somehow the Ukraine crisis in humanitarian terms has perhaps stabilized, there's no reason to believe that this very steep increase that we're witnessing basically since 2019 would come to an end. There might be a little bit less percentages of increase next year or so, but with climate crisis, the climate crisis looming, I think we will all see very clearly that both humanitarian needs stemming from humanitarian disasters, but also from protracted crises, which often are resource conflicts, obviously, unfortunately, give us no hope there would be any kind of stabilization, let alone shrinking of humanitarian needs. Although in all our official texts we speak about reducing, shrinking humanitarian needs, I frankly don't have at my age the optimism any longer that this might happen anytime soon. Now, at the ECOSOC in Geneva a week ago, you could hear two kinds of statements. One statement that said 2024 is going to be terrible, and the other statement that would say 2024 is going to be horrible, but nothing better than that. And why so? Because whereas the needs are so much on the rise, at the same time, we are not going to have the same amount of money that we have still this year or had last year in the humanitarian sector. Why is that so? Because as you know, since times immemorable, or at least since 2015, 67% of ODA is basically provided by 3 donors, And of these 3 donors, 2 are basically reducing their efforts, and the third one is struggling very hard to maintain the same level as in the past 1 or 2 years. The United States is reducing by 40% this year, next year. Germany will be reducing, not this year, but next year. And the EU will find it very, very hard to maintain its current level. We have made a good proposal for the midterm review of the financial framework, but despite the Belgian presidency and also the Spanish, of course, we don't have very much optimism that our claims will be satisfied. But even if that was the case, this would never be able to offset the reduction of US aid. In other words, we have either the possibility of continuing as we did in the past and screaming ever louder, but frankly, why should there be a change in the tendency? Or we need to do something different. And what does that mean? We have to work, I think, on 3 different approaches. One is enlarging the donor base. Secondly, bringing in innovative financial instruments. And thirdly, going for new approaches that bring us from the traditional system of humanitarian aid, from a system where basically Anglo-Saxon, Scandinavian, some Northwestern European donors finance humanitarian action in the world, we come to a global system of humanitarian aid. And this is not so much of an illusion, because in reality, you have a lot of countries in the South that are providing aid that somehow would qualify for humanitarian aid, but they are not recorded for by OECD or by OCHA. And they are not, let's say, principled in the sense we believe is principled. When you see what India is doing in its neighboring countries, responding, for example, to natural disasters like floods and so, if you see what China starts to be doing, if you see also sometimes what's happening on the African continent in forms of aid between states, you see that there's a lot of money out there. Very good example is also what's happening in the Gulf. All the formal statistics indicate that the very prominent role of countries such as the Emirates, Saudi Arabia, and also Kuwait, actually, in humanitarian aid up to 2019 has disappeared. The funding that they provided up to 2019, when let's say 2020, when due to COVID, the financial possibilities of the Gulf countries were very much reduced. These countries basically say goodbye, with the exception perhaps of Saudi Arabia, to humanitarian aid. They don't appear any longer, except Saudi Arabia, in the statistics of the top 10 donors. But when you go to the Gulf countries, and I've done so twice already this year, you hear a totally different story. The money is back. Energy prices are high. They're providing a lot of public, but also of private humanitarian aid, but it's not being recorded for. It's not being recorded for by OECD and by OCHA, because first, these amounts are not, so to say, announced in Paris or in New York. But secondly, also, because these countries almost make the policy of no longer responding to humanitarian response plans, to appeals by the United Nations support, because they don't want to use the established aid implementation system. We have to work on it. I want to resist the temptation of being too long, but speaking to experts, maybe just 2 or 3 things. You know, and Jean-Louis, you thankfully referred to it, due really to massive and very successful efforts by the Swedish presidency, we have now the 22 May Council conclusions. These Council conclusions contain 2 very important elements when it comes to the future of European humanitarian funding, European in the sense of the European Union, obviously. First, there is this call that all member states are up to, that everybody by 2030 should make available the famous 0.7% of ODA, 0.7% of GNI for ODA, and an appropriate share of this, speaking of approximately 10%, should go into humanitarian aid. This is a kind of a Europeanization of the Spanish law that you referred to. So what Spain has decided for itself as a national law, and law is powerful, so it's not only a political declaration, now has been established as a policy goal by our foreign development ministers. Our calculation shows that if every OECD member state, if every donor of ODA did that, 0.7%, and then 10% into humanitarian aid, this would cover the present humanitarian financing gap. Not sure how long it would cover it, because in 5 years from now, 10 years from now, chances are that unfortunately the gap is much bigger. But for the time being, it would be a massive contribution. We have a couple of member states that are already basically in that margin. Spain will get there. And it is a very strong encouragement for those European member states that are not yet really prominent humanitarian donors to step up their efforts or to maintain their efforts beyond the Ukraine crisis. Last week, I had talks with two vice presidents of the Committee on Foreign Affairs in the Italian Parliament. They now feel the pressure. Italy is not one of the top 10 donors, not even one of the top 20. It's the only G7 member state that doesn't have sizable humanitarian aid. And with these council conclusions, and also given the Italian interests in foreign policy and stabilization policy and so forth, I think this could trigger a debate in Italy, just as we see Spain, but also France. Belgium was already mentioned, obviously, that have stepped up their efforts, but there are, of course, many more member states that need to come on board. A little bit less known is the fact that the council conclusions don't stop with this new financial objective, but the council conclusions in a sort of annex have identified a list of 20 countries that now Europe wants to lobby to come on board. Although it may be boring, I just want to read the names of those countries because it's quite interesting. In Asia, we will have Azerbaijan, Brunei, China, India, Indonesia, Malaysia, South Korea, Singapore, Thailand, Vietnam, and in Eurasia, Turkey. Then we have the Gulf countries, basically all the Gulf countries with the exception of Oman that doesn't have the level of wealth comparable with the others. And then in Latin America, Argentina, Brazil, Chile, and Mexico. 20 countries, all of them are either OECD members or G20 members. With the exception of South Korea, none of them has sizable official humanitarian aid. But they take leadership positions in the world. Like India now is the chair of G20. Indonesia is the preceding chair, for example. They take leadership positions in certain regions, like Brazil, for example, in the Mercosur. Countries like Indonesia also in ASEAN, which has a humanitarian center. So reaching out to these countries in order to discuss, I think, two things. First, can you step up humanitarian aid? And what does it take for you to step it up? Would you want to become a humanitarian aid donor, maybe just in your neighborhood, showing solidarity with your neighbors? Or would you like to assume a global role? Saudi Arabia today, for example, attends all our donors conferences, be it on Venezuela or on Ukraine, not only on the Horn of Africa or the Muslim world proper. So we should encourage these countries basically to define a responsibility and a task in humanitarian aid. And then, of course, we should attract them to follow the pathways of the official humanitarian aid system and providing at least part of their aid as principal aid. Now, that leads me to my last point. I personally believe that if we want to be successful with this, we cannot simply ask others to join us in financing what has been done over the past years. We may be as convinced as we want of the present system. We may be as indulgent as we want about its flaws and shortcomings, but I don't believe we have a great deal of success potential if we simply say others join our club and then play by the rules of this club. And therefore, I personally believe very much that our system needs to become a global humanitarian aid system. So we need to work on the narrative. Why do we provide humanitarian aid? And I think it needs to go in the direction, one of your papers says it, that we do not only satisfy humanitarian needs according to the overcome and still very valid humanitarian principles, but also that we are moving into stabilization. Because stabilization is a foreign policy interest that mobilize resources much beyond the humanitarian community. And that is, so to say, something that the average Chinese or Indian or Mexican policymaker probably understands better than the humanitarian principles, which all too often are basically confused with charity or any kind of philanthropic approach. The second thing is there needs to be something for those new donors. Hugo already spoke about the needs of policymakers to have visibility, to have steering. That is as true in Indonesia as it is in Brussels, obviously. But I think we also need to provide offers in terms of making them part of the system. For example, it is only legitimate that new donors would say, well, what about my NGOs? What about my national aid agency? And if they are not yet at a level of professionalism, so to say, to really implement humanitarian aid, why not then partnering with our established partners? Basically to help them to mature into becoming full agents in the humanitarian system over a couple of years. And then obviously we also have to wonder whether traditional financing systems are still appropriate. When I go to the Gulf, I hear time and again that they have tried working with UN agencies and they have come to the conclusion they don't want to do this any longer. Exceptions may confirm the rules. There may be situations where, for example, when you have a massive food crisis, that a country like Saudi Arabia says, okay, the most appropriate agency to respond to the crisis is the World Food Programme, which is the UN agency. But we cannot simply expect them that, you know, the UN system wouldn't change, but they would at some point come on board and provide financing, which they stopped a couple of years ago because they found that they don't have enough influence, they don't have enough visibility, they don't have co-steering possibilities, and they are overcharged in terms of indirect support costs. Now, I don't want to comment that, but I state that there are many countries, potential or perhaps even actual providers of humanitarian aid, that are not as, let's say, multilateral and as pro-United Nations as we in Europe are. Now, if we cannot brainwash them, if we cannot change their mind, should we simply renounce to their financial possibilities, or should we work on financing mechanisms and maybe new implementing partners that would basically be more attractive to them? So in other words, I believe that if the humanitarian sector wants to stay relevant, then we need to work in these directions. And we need to work also in this direction because it is true that today humanitarian aid does many, many more things than 20 years ago. I think there is no way back. The Belgian example, whereby you will concentrate your development aid very much on fragile countries, unfortunately is rare. Most of the development donors in the meantime are moving out of fragility situations, which is one of the reasons why the Swedish presidency of the of the Council of the European Union financed also this Chatham House study about how to work in situations where we cannot work with a government, say Afghanistan or North Yemen, for example. This unfortunately will become ever more, so to say, a daily reality. And if we are interested in helping the people in such countries and also keeping migration situations and political challenges under control, if at the same time development aid doesn't engage in these countries and provides basic social services, then maybe the only possible answer is that humanitarian aid should develop more in the direction of stabilization aid, which does not mean to betray our principles, but it means to involving ourselves in the bigger political picture. Thank you.
No, thanks a lot, Michael. I mean, definitely you were not too long because you threw a lot of ideas on the table, and which is important to hear these ideas from somebody which was the opposition in the EU organigram. By the way, you made me think, we had in this very room 3 or 4 weeks ago a briefing by one of your colleagues from the European Commission, the Director General of DG International Partnership, about the global gateway. And clearly, I mean, one of the heated topic of the discussion between him and the audience was, okay, but what about fragility and stabilization? What remains available to serve that purpose? But there is a quite kind of I mean, easy move, a swift move from one speaker to another. You alluded to the role that the EU could play, and you alluded to the situation at the global level. So, Anja, okay, you are not representing, but okay, you are part of this global system as it exists today. You heard what was said by Michael. What is your response to that? Over to you.
Thank you so much, Chairman, and colleagues, friends. It's a big pleasure to be able to talk to you today and also follow this very distinguished panelists that have already spoken. So thank you so much, also Deputy Director General Mr. Brouwer and Michael Köhler. I actually think that indeed my remarks now will resonate quite well also with what has been said. And would like to remind you, of course, that the financing gap discussion is nothing new. We have been discussing this for many, many years now. Nevertheless, no one has really managed to find the magic solution for this. And our emergency relief coordinator, Martin Griffiths, just last week also at the ECOSOC has mentioned that the financing gap and the ever-growing financing gap is actually a daily reminder of our collective failure, because it means regardless what efforts we put in, the backdrop against this ever-growing financing gap means that we're actually operating with diminishing returns in our efforts, and that of course is of big concern, and we know that these concerns will continue to grow further. So let me just give you a quick slide on some stats, because a number of colleagues have already mentioned statistics around the global humanitarian overview and what is currently needed. I'm giving you the updated figures as of June 2023. So you've already heard, and I want to confirm that the global humanitarian requirements for interagency coordinated appeals have now reached a record $55 billion. So this is an increase of more than 3 billion since we actually launched this global humanitarian overview for this year in December 2022. And at the beginning of the year, we had actually indicated that the record number of 339 million people required humanitarian assistance and protection. Now, by June, the number of people in need has risen to 362 million, which is a stark increase of 22 million additional people in need of urgent humanitarian assistance. So that increase alone, the 22 million, would be a population of Mali or Sri Lanka, or almost the populations of Belgium and Sweden combined. So it is massive. This, of course, is because we have seen new crises and additional funding needs associated with a number of big events also at the beginning of the year. We have the Syria and Turkey flash appeals that have been added to the global humanitarian overview with new needs. We have the revised appeal for Myanmar in response to the cyclone Mocha. We have the revised HRP for the Sudan crisis, and of course also the regional plan for the Sudan refugee response. So all of this leads to an additional 10 billion, which we are currently asking in comparison to what we had asked already last year. Next slide, please. Some of you have already, no, this is not the next slide. Sorry, there must have been some in between that actually shows the funding gap.
So you want me to go back, Anja, to this one or to the first one?
Oh, this one. So this one. Sorry, you were already there. Sorry, I missed that. But yeah, you see the funding gap here. Some of you have already talked about shrinking resources. To be very, very honest and clear, at this point in time, we are not confronted yet. Of course, you know, we're in bold yet with shrinking resources. The system has actually seen record generosity so far, also until June this year, mid-year now. We have recorded a record high of $11 billion that have been mobilized. This is similar in terms of proportional levels to previous years. Funding coverage is around 20% at this point in time. Given that, of course, funding needs are higher in absolute terms of funding, there is, of course, an increase that we currently can see. Nevertheless, funding gap ever increasing, 43 billion. Which are not currently covered, and of course, you know, we will have a hard time in mobilizing towards the end of the year, and we already know that we will not meet those. That means this is an additional 10 billion gap that we are seeing as compared to previous years at this moment in time now. So, but of course, as everyone said, we know already now that 2024 is going to be a very hard year. We already have had announcements from our big donors around cuts, and quite significant cuts, and Michael has already referred to them. I'm currently in Berlin talking to the parliamentarians at the Bundestag, and indeed it really looks very gloomy and the mood is not very positive. And of course, Germany is a big player at this point in time as the second largest donor. And if they will also see significant cuts, then we really are in a tough ride here. Overall, of course, there is no silver bullet in addressing this. When we look at how to expand our funding base and also the volume that we could mobilize, I would agree also with previous speakers that we need to work with those that have the fiscal space to either increase their contribution to the humanitarian system or actually join the humanitarian system. There are many high-income countries that are currently either not contributing or are way below what they could be doing, measuring them also in terms of the GNI contributions to ODA and also to humanitarian efforts. So there is definitely a strong focus for our work that is required, focusing on those high and middle income countries, in particular also higher middle income countries. In this context, of course, we also greatly welcome the European Council resolution that was already referred to, because that, of course, sets a nice benchmark. It sets a nice benchmark that we could also use in discussions going beyond the EU member states, but also measuring, of course, EU member states in the years to come. But in addition, of course, the Gulf countries were already mentioned. They definitely have the fiscal space and the ability to contribute more, with many caveats there. Nevertheless, we have the BRICS countries. We already heard the whole list presented by Michael, also including a lot of the emerging economies in Asia, Latin America. I would also like to add Africa to this list as well. As an example, let me tell you that the OCHA managed SURF, the Central Emergency Response Fund, at this point in time has 58 donors, which shows that there is actually a broad opportunity also to tap into those that already have made contributions, of course, at varying levels and significantly varying levels. But I also want to let you know that this year, for the first time, we actually had also contribution from a low-income country like Zambia, for instance. So even though, again, these are modest amounts, there is some potential also reach out much broader to other partners and make sure that they become part and parcel of this global system that also Michael referred to. In addition to working with those that actually can and should be providing more, I think we also need to crowd in additional new funding resources. And here we really have to have a very, very clear discussion on who these partners could be that could come to the table with additional financing. This, of course, relates to the IFIs, the international financing institutions. It relates to the private sector. And it also relates to private sector in these local new markets. We've already mentioned China, India, but also Malaysia, etc. there, where they have a very, very strong giving culture and also opportunities for partnering with the government in certain efforts in development and hopefully also on humanitarian affairs. There's the whole set of climate financing, which we need to seriously consider also for humanitarian action. And of course, the innovative financing mechanisms. And Michael has already alluded to this. These have been discussed quite extensively at the World Humanitarian Summit in 2016. Nevertheless, very little has actually happened since then, but I really see a lot of potential also to look into those innovative financing mechanisms, look into impact bonds that have been partially already piloted, but I think there are opportunities there that we could further explore. Debt swaps is an instrument also to be considered. There's of course also the taxes and levies that should be looked into. Just referring to the currently discussed tax on global shipping and other big sources of greenhouse gas emissions, and seeing whether this is something that the humanitarian field could also tap into. Definitely an area I want to put at the table for further discussion. Let me give a quick reference to the private sector, because I've mentioned that they should also be part and parcel of our discussion. This is now the next slide, please, Yolanda. So as you can see here, this is the latest report launched by DI Development Initiatives. And here you can actually see that we are indeed actually seeing, even for this year, but also for last year, we have seen a quite significant increase also in humanitarian financing made available. And across the private sector alone, there was a 2 billion increase over previous years. This was, of course, 2022. It was the beginning of the Ukraine crisis, which has sparked extraordinary mobilization also among the private sector and also among individuals that added their giving to the humanitarian financing landscape. But there are definitely opportunities also to build on this. And we have seen also similar levels, not really levels, but similar mobilization potential also in response to the earthquake, for instance, in Turkey and northwest Syria. So definitely something to look into, in my view, also for all of us. The next and last slide I wanted to present to you is on climate financing. I really believe that we need to work in the climate and climate financing sphere with our partners and also with new partners, because climate justice is, of course, a big issue that plays into what we see in terms of needs rising in those protected crises that we are working with in these fragile contexts, and also where the most vulnerable are currently not covered with climate financing. Here on the slide, you can see that those countries that actually are highly climate vulnerable and that are in protected crises, because this is where the report was able to generate data, are the least funded out of the whole set of where climate financing is going. So on average, per capita, only $1.01 of climate financing is reaching those contexts that we are most interested in. And there's definitely something that needs to change, and also where joint advocacy needs to happen across board. Let me just quickly summarize. I fully subscribe to the call from Michael Köhler for a global humanitarian aid system. I actually would also like to introduce the concept here of global solidarity and shared responsibility, because I believe humanitarian action should be a global public good that is actually underpinned by efforts around making sure that everyone contributes to global solidarity, but also shared responsibility, because everyone can and should contribute as well. We need cultural shifts, again, fully aligned with previous speakers. We need a holistic look at this. There is no one size fits all in the way we are dealing with our partners. We need to understand whom we are targeting as potential partners that come to this global system, but also see what their needs are, and we need to cater for that. We need to develop long-term partnerships instead of using a more transactional approach, which very often in the humanitarian sphere is happening. And we also need to sit at the table where relevant discussions are happening. Hence, my reference also to the climate financing discussion, because the humanitarian system also needs to be very present in upcoming opportunities, COP28 and others, just to name a few there. And we should not be afraid of discussions that this might potentially divert money away from humanitarian action, which unfortunately is already repeated quite often. I think we need to confront this heads on and be there together. And then, of course, the issue of visibility, communication, better communication, and innovation have already been mentioned. So let me stop here, colleagues. Thank you very much. And back to you, Chairman.
No, thank you very much. So a lot of commonalities with what was said earlier, but okay, a huge agenda also. I mean, when listening to you, I mean, you are covering you covered a wide range of possible solution and action to be taken. And we all know in a way that, okay, the global system is also maybe not as agile as it should be to cater for these humanitarian emergency, because I refer to what you said, Michael, about the tonality of the intervention to the ecosystem. so from horrible to terrible. It's tomorrow, 2024, literally. Now, let me turn to Marta Garcia. I mean, we would like to hear from you. How does that translate on the ground? I mean, what are these challenges, these financial challenges? What is their impact on the intervention and the action of a major NGO, in that case, Oxfam? Marta, over to you.
Thank you very much, and thank you to the Egmont Institute and NRC for inviting us to be part of this panel. I will tackle on this question on how we see this reality at the field level with the different partners, but I would like to start by sharing the fact that at the end of May, the 25th and the 26th of May, together with the Red Cross, the British Red Cross and Oxfam, we convened a session in Ditchley that was speaking about the financing gap, the humanitarian financing gap. And the main objective, the main goal of this meeting that gather a lot of different aspects with different profiles from private sector, from donors, from practitioners, UN, NGOs and other. The main objective was to try to identify feasible options to propose solutions to cover the financing gap. We gathered for 2 days, and over these 2 days, we analyzed some of the advances and as well things that didn't advance at all after the high-level panel on humanitarian financing that took place in 2016, prior to the World Humanitarian Summit. And it was quite interesting to analyze with other colleagues from a point of urgency, because I feel that all of us, we feel the sensation of urgency. Definitely, as an international NGO, we feel it in places like East Africa, in Somalia, in Ethiopia, in South Sudan, when we are facing a great food crisis and resources are so reduced that it's very, very difficult to scale up the responses, and we have to make choices. Yeah, while in other crises, the money is flowing much faster. So we discussed about the increased gap and the concern, and definitely to the need to find solutions, but quick solutions. Because it's right that there is a question about the relevance, but I do wonder, are we waiting to be declared redundant? Because if resources are stretching, needs are exploding, and some funds are flowing through other channels, maybe if we are not able to find solutions, a new system could be emerging. Yeah. So potentially we will have to join forces instead of trying to define power domains. But anyway, we discussed about it. We discussed about the need to build trust. I think that there is a big trust deficit in the sector, definitely with the general society, but definitely with donors that are not part of the OECD DAC, and they are not some of the key donors contributing resources to the sector. Others, as has been clearly explained by other panelists, there is a gap in terms of trust. And that is quite important. And to some extent, languages are very, very different. Our conversations around the humanitarian sector is quite different if we speak, for example, with Gulf donors or with other. Yeah. So there is a trust deficit. And we discussed quite extensively about this question of the narrative, and I would like to bring a couple of caveats to that. We discussed as well about climate financing and the fact that climate is adding a layer of complexity and severity to the crisis. And as well, we listened to the concern of colleagues working on climate, the same concerns that humanitarians and development actors were having at the beginning of the Nexus, to which extent that was going to be a movement in order to share funding and not to increase funding. The same concerns are coming from the climate community. And definitely the question about private sector, because we have been speaking for years about bringing private sector closer to humanitarian crises. And while there has been a number of experiences, is right, about bonds, insurances related to climate events, but still is quite timid. We are not advancing at a good path, and there was an expectation we could be doing something, but there is the trust deficit that is playing as well an important role there. And then finally, from the conviction that there is not going to be only one solution that is going to bring a magic band to our challenge, in Ditchley, 3 main areas of what were identified. And I'm going to start by the one that for the time being is the one that I have less insights, but it's around climate and it's about a polluter's tax, about taxing specific wealth sources in order to bring some resources that will cover the needs of the population that is less responsible of climate change, but is paying the hardest bill for it. So there is a momentum, there is a space for that, but there will be a need to join forces with some of the climate actors in order to define which kind of taxation, which kind of mechanism, who will be in charge of collecting, how that will be distributed, what will be the channels to ensure that the money is flowing. Some complexity, but it's not impossible. It will be a good option to analyze. The second option that was as well discussed quite extensively and still in discussion and forming is around a financial facility. It is about developing for the private sector and space, and not only with the private sector, but with all the key actors, and a space to discuss the role of private sector and the different facility tools channels, but to simplify. It will be a way to understand what the private sector needs. It will be as well a way to explain to the private sector the part of the share in the problem, because it's a global problem, and to look for solutions. There is work that is forming there, and there are a number of agencies that are looking at bonds, insurances, investment of different kinds from the private sector into the humanitarian domain. And the last point that we discussed was about a partnership, what we call the fragility partnership. And that is linked to this idea of expanding the donor base, but it's coming from another angle that I find that adds a level of complexity, but as well, it could help with the solution. And it's the fact that for years, the sector has been trying to expand the donor base. So it's a sector that exists with a clear vision and principles, trying to expand and bring others to the conversation. While developing a partnership, it is something that we will start from zero, bringing others into the conversation and trying to overcome the existing silos from the very beginning. That comes from as well from the conviction that in all the Nexus work that we have been working from different perspectives and different mandates for the last 7 years, there are clear barriers to the implementation of it. And the barriers are, among others, the lack of incentives in order of changing behaviors and changing dynamics. So generating a partnership where all the different actors will come to the table explaining the vision and developing a new system that could be based on a new social contract that will really be a good foundations for having a global good, a public global good as a humanitarian system could be, and we believe should be analyzed further. So that is what we definitely discussing in Ditchley, and we are moving in this direction. And I wanted to add some of the perceptions of what we see in the field. But first of all, I think that it will be quite important as well to get the perceptions from local actors that are the frontliners of the responses and are the ones that are more stretched in terms of the resources. Because, as it was explained in a couple of occasions by ODI in their annual report in relation to the Grand Bargain, all the efforts from donors in terms of providing better quality funding, more flexible, more multi-year, is not cascading down. It's not going down to the local actors. There are the actors that are frontline working with the community. Those local actors, in general terms, they have less capacity to plan. They have less capacity to retain their human resources and to develop their capacities. That is what we see. We see as well a system that is not very global balanced. We see a system that is able to invest in some responses more than others. And there is this question about closeness to the challenges that is definitely challenging the humanitarian principles of it. We finally definitely find a situation where all the efficiencies that we engage and commit to do with the Grand Bargain, some are moving, but the path of the change is not as it should be. And definitely not only looking at others, we look at ourselves, definitely in Oxfam, and we look about what we need to change. Because definitely, if there is a deficit trust in the sector, it's because potentially every and each of us, we are not doing as well as we should do. So we are looking at how we can support differently local actors, how we can share our more precious source of flexible resources with them. We are looking about how we can be a better intermediary. And we are looking as well at innovative approaches that will allow us to use power differently, because the sector has power dynamics that are not helping us advance into efficiency gains. So potentially there is a reflection that we need to do as a sector around power dynamics. So let me stop here, because I would really love to engage in the debate. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much indeed. Time is passing, but I mean, all these interventions are so rich and opening new doors each time. You said it yourself, time is of the essence. I mean, there is no time for complacency, but the situation is difficult. And I heard also that there was a reference to the no size fits all approach. But okay, you confirm that indeed on the ground, this leads to, I mean, cut in aid, and that will make the priority given by the Belgian presidency, incoming Belgian presidency, to forgotten crisis all the more relevant. Now, to close this first round of intervention, I will now turn to Edouard Rodier. Edouard, you co-authored the two papers that were referred to as the basis for this webinar, this workshop, I'm sorry. So the floor is yours.
Thank you, Jean-Louis, and thank you all for being here. It's very striking. There are a lot of connecting messages in what we've heard today. And I would like to start by saying that I think there are already a number of great efforts that were done. I mean, I think all of us mentioned it, and yes, we do absolutely need the grand bargain. I'm very pleased, Michael, that you decided to take that new responsibility to promote it. There's been some important work done. There are more to be done, and to make sure that the aid is delivered in an efficient and effective way. The element we mentioned, the recent conclusion of the council, yes, it's an important signal that is being sent to the member states, but it's not mandatory. Let's see what it brings. All this is necessary, and it's critical because the people in need are in need now. Still, what I would like to contribute with is really by adding to what has been already said about trying to look at the greater picture as we've done, and I think the figures that were shared forces us to do so, because as it was said as well, if we don't do that, we will become irrelevant as a sector. The relevance of the sector is our ability to meet the needs of the most vulnerable people. So, and everything that we've heard already today shows that we are not on the right path. So I believe we need to look at how we can change our approach, how we can look at I'm hesitant to use the word transformative, but really a truly transformative approach, for a number of reasons that I'm going to try to list some, and some have already been said. The system was created to respond to emergency needs. And today we are responding to protracted crisis. A forcibly displaced person, on average, is displaced for 9 years at least. I was noting as well that 80% of people in need live in a country that had UN appeals for the 5 past consecutive years. So these are not emergencies. These are protracted crises, and we need to adapt to these. We've mentioned it, and the gap is huge. And the gap is growing. And I think what we've heard today again is that the perspective for the main donors, and the very too few main donors, are not very positive. So yes, we need to continue working on becoming more effective, more efficient, but we need to look at the broader issue. And we need to ask ourselves, I think if we want to address this funding gap, we need to ask ourselves, why isn't it that humanitarian aid is triggering more interest? We can't be I mean, we need to ask ourselves, how is it that what is going to trigger the, you mentioned incentive, exactly. How is it, what is the incentive for donors to put more money on the table? And to answer that, I think we need to look at some of the challenges. The decolonization agenda is a huge one. I mean, we all know, and it means that inside our own sector, we are challenging ourselves, as we should, because if we look at the humanitarian country team, well, it's a UN-led with you have in the room you will have the International Red Cross, the international NGO, the international donors. If you're lucky, you're going to have a member of affected communities, but it's an international-led response. And with very little space being made for others. If we look at what is defining what we are doing, the humanitarian principle, the IHL, and their universal nature, well, this universal nature is being challenged. And when we look and when we look at what's happening in Ukraine, what we are seeing as well is that the biggest champion of these principles are not defending them. And I'm looking at the EU, for instance. I mean, it's it's very and if I think how those who are already a bit in doubt vis-a-vis the true universal nature of IHL and humanitarian principles, when they see that in Ukraine the principle of neutrality is not championed like it can be championed in other places, what does that say about and when do we start looking into these issues? And if I can add one more, when we look at the development standpoint and the way developmentalists maybe look at humanitarian aid, many of them, you will correct me, but consider that this is money lost for the SDGs. While if we look at it, we need to reconcile a necessary operational continuity between long and short and longer term, and the fact that there is no continuity in funding. So that there are really important things that need to be looked into. Maybe let me add a couple of more. All this and the figures that we heard, 55 billion as a global humanitarian overview, leads to another aspect of the sector, which is that large actors have a premium. I mean, UN agencies, ICRC, NRC, we are big and we become bigger because we need to be compliant, because we need to be able to have to be able to resist financial risk. Look at the ICRC. It's an organization that can take a $500 million blow and continue. So, I mean, this is the kind of entity that are needed today to meet humanitarian realities. And then you have another reality, which Marta portrayed very well, which is that the bulk of the response is provided by local and national entities. So how do we reconcile these? And really, I would like to emphasize again on what has been said: global humanitarian overview. It sounds like we're covering it all. No, it's not that global. It's a global versus regional, global versus, I mean, it's the global of New York, Geneva, Brussels, versus other realities that are regional, that are local, that are, we need to ask ourselves, how do we connect these so-called global with other realities? Michael, you mentioned very, I mean, all these dynamics that you can find in other regions and so on. How do we connect? How do we not tell them what to do, but how do we connect with another ways of looking at things and another way of helping? Because in the interest of time, I think these are some of the elements I wanted to put on the table. Maybe I stop here so that there is more space for discussion. But really, thank you very much for all these contributions already, and over to you, Jean-Louis.
No, thank you very much. So if I look at the clock, we should have only 15 minutes left for the discussion. Well, I can extend it a little bit. There is, for the time being, only one comment, but no question after. And a question, yes, indeed. So it's a question asked by Halsdorf. Do we need to lobby against upcoming cuts by other, not very principled narratives, and highlighting less humanitarian and more geopolitical reasons to act as a true humanitarian donor. The geopolitics of humanitarian aid. Who wants to take that question?
Well, I think yes, absolutely. I've asked a question that is rhetoric. Because the alternative is that nothing changes. And we have all said why it would be a disaster if nothing changes. By the way, and really grateful to Edouard and to Marta, not only because we have financial constraints, but because the present system is a system that is coming from the 20th century. It's no longer made for the world of the 21st century. Much of the response is local. In the worst crisis, in the most constrained environments, when I travel, I see very competent local NGOs. And it's true that these local NGOs are not yet, so to say, fully benefiting from funding streams. And we're only at the start of really treating them like real partners, not only as subcontractors. I mean, the localization guidelines that ECHO gave itself a couple of months ago now foresee that when it comes to needs assessment, when it comes to strategic discussions, when it comes to monitoring, local partners are just as much partners and are involved in all the discussions as our established partners such as Oxfam, for example. So these new ways of doing that ultimately will lead to what Edouard calls a decolonialization. These need to be phased in. But if we believe that the needs of a humanitarian nature are daunting, and if we believe that the present system, both on the financing side and the implementing side, will be so short of possibilities to address these new needs, new challenges, that we need to go beyond, then clearly everything that Ralph says there it needs to come up. And frankly, I don't have any problem with that. I don't reckon with the fact that you know, in every country that has money, we would have so many good souls that they all decide that we should be more charitable. What we can expect is that each country has signed the 4th Geneva Convention. So they have taken legal commitments on which we can remind them, and we can ask them basically to also put some resource into this. But I don't see any problem to argue that by providing humanitarian aid, they would also serve, let's say, certain stabilization foreign policy interests. Why is Germany now the second or the third most important donor in the humanitarian world? It has to do with the influx of Syrian refugees in 2015. Germany was not such an important donor in humanitarian terms in 2013, 2014, or 2012. So clearly there was a political narrative that has nothing to do with humanitarian needs in the short term, but with a very vital migration and stabilization concern. There's nothing wrong with that. And I'm sure, I've not yet done that, Ugo, but I'm sure when I'm looking at the list of Belgian beneficiaries, I would also find some political reasoning behind. What is then important is how this aid is being implemented. And I think that is also something we need to discuss with new donors and future donors. The way how this is being implemented it has to be principled. There are many good reasons. That's not the subject matter of this debate, but there are many good reasons why neutrality, independence, and support have to be safeguarded, but we need to have a critical discussion about that. I'm really grateful to Edouard about this kind of little bit snappy side remark about Ukraine. I think we could discuss for quite some time to which extent, for example, European humanitarian aid in Ukraine is neutral or not neutral. It is easy to present this as taking sides with Ukraine, but it is a wrong perception, because on the one hand, until 24 February last year, European humanitarian aid in Ukraine was active only in the separatist areas and the Russian occupied areas. And secondly, also our colleagues in the United Nations are, of course, trying very hard to get access to those areas where you have Russian military right now. So we are absolutely ready to provide aid there. ICRC is ready to go there. So it's not for lack of trying. It's not because we would have, let's say, mobilized aid in order to support the side in the war that we sympathize with politically. But of course, it is true that in many scenarios, aid is appears to be taking side, for example, because it can only be provided in those areas where you have government military. Think of Northeast Nigeria, for example. This is something which we have to address because that is a big problem for the credibility of the approach. But you know, we would already be done one step further if we had a discussion with all those countries that are skeptical about the present approach about these issues. For the time being, we don't even talk. And I think we need to create a dynamic for this talk. There can be different ways of doing that. We can use the established formats like the General Assembly and have side events. I don't know whether Belgium is planning something in that regard. And always happy to do that together with ECHO. But you also know that, for example, in October, we plan to have the first ever EU GCC ministerial meeting on humanitarian aid. This is also a consequence of council conclusions of a proposal that the Commission and the High Representative did together in 2021. So we want to have a structured approach to sit down with those people and those countries that are really critical to find out what it takes in order to get them on board. This will be an uphill fight, but if nobody starts with it, it will never be won.
I would, before giving the floor to Marta and Anya, who both have raised their hands, I would add to that very simply and in a very down-to-earth legal way, the legal basis for humanitarian aid, which is enshrined in the EU treaty, says exactly that the humanitarian aid must be principled, but is also implemented in the framework of the priorities of EU external relations. It's all there. So, fine, Marta and Anya. Marta first, maybe, please.
So a couple of points in relation to that. So fully agree that I think that, and this is why we are proposing this partnership. A partnership needs to have an open conversation, and an open conversation where parts can agree to disagree. And only by tackling the disagreement and the different perspectives, there will be possible to advance. I have to say as well that in general terms, on the humanitarian principles is never so clear. It's never yes or not. There are plenty of caveats, and applying the principles on a day-to-day basis raise a lot of questions, and there are plenty of trade-offs. Yeah, I do absolutely believe that we need to remain principled, but there is a need to have an open conversation and to unpack all the different details and what are the expectations from the side. However, one thing that I would like as well to bring to the table is that by having a partnership and by having a conversation, it does not mean that we need to lose or to drop the knowledge, the experience and the know-how that has been developed over years. Definitely, we need to unpack the decolonial agenda. We need to recognize the power dynamics, the decision-making, and all those existing structures, how they operate. But definitely, there is a need to maintain and to retain the positive aspects. And to be honest, after what? In the last years, in the last 50 years, there has been plenty of advances in the humanitarian sector. We need to build on those. But we need as well to take advantage on the fact that in a lot of cases, and we need to unpack why this has happened, my perception is that when we are confronted to the need of change, whether we are speaking about the donors, different agencies, or any of us, there is an institutional resilience that exists. There is normally a flow and a know how we work and a concern and a fear about things, how things are going to evolve. And to be honest, I think I fully understand where this fear is coming for, because if we are not able to deliver the humanitarian assistance, people is going to suffer. So I think that what we need definitely is to spend 6 months, the coming 6 months, with high-level leadership, champion a solid conversation with key leaders in relation to how we are going to reform the sector, how we are going to build this new partnership. And definitely that needs to be done as well with the local actors. We can't we can upfront this discussion only with Western colleagues. Thank you.
Thank you, Anya. I'm sure that we'll want to follow up on certain things that Marta just said, but you rather also raise your hand following previous intervention. The floor is yours.
Indeed, thank you so much. Yeah, I want to first thank Ralph for the intervention here, because I think it's twofold what he's putting out there. I mean, he also raised this big concern about the impeding cuts that we are confronted with, and definitely I want to encourage everyone, including also OCHA and colleagues here, to lobby against these enormous cuts, given that we are really looking at very concerning numbers. Michael already mentioned 40% in the US. Germany also looks similar at this point in time. At the same time, of course, we cannot just stop 40% of the crises, right? And people that need support and are heavily reliant on the assistance. So definitely, we need to think about ways of lobbying against these cuts, but also using, of course, narratives that work with the audiences that we are operating with. And these are parliamentarians, decision makers, often driven, of course, by very, very strong, or always driven by political agendas. So we need to be able also to communicate in a way that resonates. Just also to mention that we are often requesting donors to be more risk-taking and also look into new ways of operating. I think also for the humanitarian system, we should kind of rethink also how we approach this and become more open-minded on a number of issues, while not implementing, of course, the principles in a different way, but being open-minded. Let me give you an example. We just 2 weeks ago, we organized the Sudan Pledging Conference, the high-level pledging conference for Sudan. It was actually a big struggle to get the co-hosts united in a very short period of time. But you might have noticed that we had Egypt as a co-host, we had Qatar, we had the Saudi Arabia there, we had ECHO, and we had the African Union. That is an unusual in Germany as well. This is an unusual large group, but it was really felt that we need to reach out also to those groups that, of course, have a certain interest in the conflict, have a certain interest, you know, also more in the geopolitical sphere around this, but also balancing it out. And there were a lot of questions why we actually brought several of those partners on board, but in the end, it really paid off. So just to say that this is something we need to navigate, and we need to bring everyone who actually has an active interest also to the table to really make a difference. So thank you.
Thank you very much, please.
Thanks a lot for the invitation. My name is Maria Grönewald. I'm the director of VOICE, the largest network of European humanitarian organizations, Oxfam, NRC, amongst others. And I have read the two papers with interest. These are also topics we are discussing a lot with our members, nexus, localization, and also the funding gap. And we're also trying to nurture the discussion. So we're organizing a roundtable in September in Madrid to discuss these three topics, with hopefully the participation of ECHO, of the Belgian Ministry, and of course the Spanish in the framework of the EU presidency of Spain. And what of course also concerns us is really how to create the political interest in those neglected crises, where there are maybe not in the neighborhood of emerging donors or traditional donors. And it's really something where we also have to ask ourselves, what can we do to keep interest up for these neglected crises when it's not next to Saudi Arabia or close to the heart of the traditional donors. So, thank you.
No, thank you very much. Are there other questions either in the room or in online? I don't see any comment online or question online. Hugo, I'm quite tempted to turn to you again.
Okay.
Because after all, you will inaugurate a year which will be somewhere between horrible and terrible. We've heard that. How do you feel after having heard and listened to what you heard and what you listened to?
Thank you.
Uncomfortable.
Of course, because after all, it is daunting, and we still continue to realize that. But because the situation is what it is, and therefore it is unavoidable to try to look for a way out. And what I heard especially today were a couple of elements of building blocks and so forth, where we can work on a strategy to try to get through this. Mm-hmm. And as I said, I will be in Madrid by the end by the end of the month to talk to our Spanish brethren as well, and to see how we develop a little bit the roadmap for those 18 months as I described. I think there are a couple of elements here that we'll put forward on the table, and where we can make the link with the council conclusions as well, and see how we can go forward. So actually, I feel inspired as well.
Okay, good to hear that. Yes, please, there was a question there.
It's not so much a question as a comment, and I just wanted to build on what you were sort of mentioning there, that spirit of optimism, this spirit of hope, I think is so fundamental when it comes to this discussion. I think it's potentially a very dangerous road we start to go down if we assimilate this kind of feeling of despair, that rather than thinking genuinely about radical change and alternatives, we simply assimilate a model which is inherently problematic, that we start to define charity as something that we reject, that somehow philanthropic interest is unwieldy or not relevant any longer because the world is moving on and we need to be operating as a geopolitical player, and you know, principles of neutrality are less relevant today. And I think actually now is the moment to kind of be really galvanizing who the leaders of tomorrow are going to be, what the spirit of tomorrow is going to be, and tapping into that energy and that sense of possibility. And I really like the idea of a facility of a world that we create together, rather than necessarily just putting our hands up and saying, yeah, I mean, we want to do something because ultimately it means that, you know, our back garden looks a little prettier. And I think we underestimate the good that there's left in the world. There are a lot of people, and I think the next generation is coming through now, that, you know, maybe it's difficult for some of us who've been in the sector for a while to hold on to the sense of what could be. But I think it's also important to kind of bring those voices into the discussion to imagine a little bit broader.
We'll come back on that. Mikael.
Yeah, and I apologize, I have to run away for another meeting, but I think there's this old saying, never waste a good crisis. And that's exactly it. We all seem to agree on our analysis. So now you have two possibilities: either ostrich's policy, you know, we put the head in the sand, or we say, okay, listen, maybe this creates pressure that we can use for something constructive. And my impression after listening to all the interventions is we don't need to invent the wheel here. The wheel is there. We just need to get it to roll. So very concretely, for example, how do we organize these meetings with potential new donors? What is the Belgian presidency going to do in that respect? For example, what can the Commission do? What can OCHA do? Secondly, how can we operationalize the localization agenda? I mean, concretely, in 2 or 3 major crises, what can we do, maybe test cases, pilot cases, to really empower local partners? Financial instruments, Martha was very, very articulate on that. I mean, there's so many financial instruments. I have to say, every time I speak to people from the financial sector, and I had a video conference 2 days ago with representatives of the Luxembourg Stock Exchange, I feel totally encouraged. The sector, the financial sector, is waiting for humanitarian financial instruments, be it bonds, be it blending solutions, so forth. They are really waiting for. There is investment capital. But we never bring the communities together, except from 4 or 5 different pilots that have been started by organizations like the Danish Refugee Council or IRC or so, or also UNICEF has tried something. Nothing's really happening. I acknowledge the potential may be limited, but not using even this limited potential makes the things even worse. So let us find dynamic ways, let us show leadership in order to at least explore some of these possibilities. If that doesn't work, let's have another meeting where we simply share our depression. But at this moment in time, I think it's not yet too late to start with a couple of approaches.
You, in a way, took the words out of my mouth. I was going to conclude this meeting and mention some takeaways. In a few words, what strikes me listening to our conversation this afternoon is that nothing that was said is fundamentally new. I glanced recently at the high-level panel report, which inspired the creation of the Grand Bargain. Everything was in there already. The difference is that now the magnitude of the crisis, the staggering figures that many of you quoted in the beginning of this discussion. I really have to say that the EU has shown the way. That is to say, there was a kind of a gigantic brainstorming exercise, which was the forum, and the forum led to an action being taken, which translates into the conclusion, which are rather operational. You mentioned that yourself. So the responsibility of the incoming presidency is to make them work. That they don't, I mean, as is too often the case for this infamous EU soft law, that they don't remain in a ladder hidden somewhere, but that the successive presidencies, together with the Commission, take the member states to account for what they are been signing up, whether it is about this new kind of humanitarian diplomacy, you mentioned it yourself, or simply looking at the figures. Where are you in trying to meet the targets which is quoted? And that should now be followed up. Now, at the global level, and I would follow what you said, Edouard. I mean, okay, we are all aware of that. I'm not referring to the EU anymore, but at the global level. Okay, but who is taking the lead and what should trigger the move? I was thinking, you mentioned the event in the margin of the UN Assembly during the Ministerial Week. I've been there a couple of times in my old days. And these events are repetitive. They are always dealing with the same topic from one year to another. Not that these topics are unimportant, but simply it's about more of the same. Why should maybe Belgium, together with the EU, take this opportunity to, for once, have a different type of panel? And I mean, open new paths, this having a new item on the agenda. We all know that, okay, please, I apologize for the cynicism of what I'm going to say. We all know that the protection of children in conflict is an important issue, but it has been dealt with already 3 to 4 or 5 times. So why don't we bring to the agenda of this high-level session something new around the topics that we discussed this afternoon, decolonization of aid, a true commitment for localization, for instance. Now, there can also be much more done at the EU level, if you allow me, Michael. In the course of the next 12 months, the EU at European Council level will start the preparation of its next strategic agenda. The President of the European Council has now issued a letter explaining its working method. The external dimension of the EU, call it whatever you want, will be one of these priorities. Is it unthinkable that in the paragraph dedicated to that issue, there would be only one sentence, which would refer to what we discussed already today and the cruciality, the strategic importance of humanitarian aid when it comes to indeed the geopolitical dimension of the Union. It would be only one sentence, but it would be blessed by the heads of state and government, and it would be there for 5 years. It would be there for 5 years. So I think that one should think about creating the momentum, exactly like the EU did with the forum following by the conclusion, which would trigger a move, which is going to be clearly a radical move at global level. We'll keep on working on that. We were very happy as Egmont to be able to support Sweden and ECHO in organizing the previous forum. We are extremely grateful because it's thanks to you that we are able to continue working on that. We are going to continue working on that, possibly also ahead of the next forum. But now that EU has shown by example what could be done, EU should also be kind of an engine of extending this energy or sharing this energy at a more global level. So there is more to come. Thanks a lot to all of you for having. So there is hope. There is hope. That's what I wanted to say. It's no question of just sitting idle and moving from one depressing exchange of view to another depressing exchange of view. But okay, all those ideas, exactly like Michael mentioned, must now be transformed into deed and action. And we have to try to find a way to move from the strategic discussion to the operationalization of them. Thanks for having attended this workshop this afternoon. Thanks to Hugo Brouwer, thanks to our panelists, thanks to the colleagues Thierry and Ionela, who have been quite instrumental in preparing this session. There will be more of these to come after the summer break, and in the meanwhile, I wish you all a restful holiday. Thank you for your participation. Bye. Bye.
Thank you so much. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you.